Welcome to Start Before You're Ready, the podcast that proves that you don't need to wait for the perfect moment to begin your journey towards better health and happiness. I'm your host, Kelly Young. Remember, the first step is often the hardest, but it's always worth taking. Hey guys, it's Kelly, and I am back with an incredibly exciting episode of Start Before You're Ready. I promised you guys that I was going to get some expert guests on, and today is the day. Today I have Todd Miller. He is an exercise physiologist, professor, and public health researcher exploring why modern health keeps declining despite better nutrition choices. He's the executive director of the Council of Accreditation of Strength and Conditioning Education and chief science officer at Live Lean RX, a national chain of body composition and metabolism testing centers. His work centers around on how physical inactivity, not diet, is the primary driver of modern metabolic disease. And I just want to give you guys a little bit of background on how I know Todd. So I actually went into Todd's lab at George Washington as somebody seeking advice. Even though I'm a fitness professional and I've been in this field for a long time, I was feeling like I was in a situation where I worked out a lot. I had a lot of muscle. I felt good. I was doing everything right, but I was scared of carbs. I was afraid to eat carbs because I felt like if I ate, I ate carbs. I ate a lot of vegetables. I did eat carbs, but I was very minimal on what I would allow myself to eat because I felt like when I ate carbs, I would gain weight. And I was really conscious of my weight. I had fought my weight my whole life. It's part of my story. And I went to Todd and Stephanie. Stephanie is a registered dietitian and did their testing. And I want to say it was life-changing. Todd might not know this, but I want to say it was life-changing for me because I just needed somebody to tell me how I could incorporate more carbohydrates into my diet. And that's exactly what they did. They did a lot more than that. I have all the paperwork. It was very extensive testing. I hope Todd will talk about it a little bit today, the DEXA tests that they use, the gold standard of testing. So ever since then, he's been someone that I've followed, both him and Stephanie, and just really looked up to in the field, obviously, for what he does for his research and for how he helps people. And I especially love what he's doing right now because it's so in line with what I truly believe. And he's going to talk about all that today. But Todd, let me first just let you go ahead and introduce yourself to our Start Before You're Ready community.
All right. Well, thanks, Kelly. Thanks for having me on. And thanks to everybody who's going to be listening to this. Like Kelly said, we met when I was director of the Weight Management and Human Performance Lab at George Washington University. And I started that lab. And one of the things that I always sort of wondered was, we have all these high-tech forms of testing, things like a DEXA scan, as Kelly mentioned, for body composition. We have indirect calorimetry to measure gas analysis to see how many calories you burn. And we've always sort of done this in a research environment, but I didn't really ever know of anyone who did this for the public. So I thought to myself, when we come up with dietary interventions for a research study, if we would come up like for a weight loss study, for example, the way you do this is you determine how many calories somebody burns by measuring their metabolism, and then you reduce those calories by a certain amount, and then lo and behold, you get weight loss, right? Your protein prescription should be based on how much muscle mass you have. And so we use a DEXA scan to measure muscle mass, and then boom, we would give somebody a protein prescription. So I thought, why can't we just take these technologies and make them available to the public? So that's what we did at George Washington University. That's also what we do at Live Lean RX. That's just, we do that nationwide in our labs. But it allows us to really tailor diet programs to an individual's metabolism and their muscle mass. So it's pretty much unique to you. And when people follow these things, when people follow a prescription that's based on muscle mass and their metabolism, you remove a lot of guesswork. And when that guesswork is removed, it becomes Usually the results that you get from those tightly controlled types of intakes are much better and much easier to obtain. So that's really what started me down that whole path of using these technologies for the general public. And now we're seeing that more widespread with other commercial companies that do the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So Todd, tell us a little bit about what you do, what you do worldwide, like how that works, because we have an audience that might be in a spot where I heard you on another podcast, or actually I think it was a webinar, talk about how pretty much every place has a DEXA. They might not think they do, or wherever you're sending them. Can you talk a little bit about that?
One of the things we did at the lab was at GW, we'd constantly be getting contacted by people who would say, hey, is there any way that I can work with you if I'm a remote client? I'm not anywhere near there. And I said, well, yeah, we would just find a place that does DEXA and metabolism testing. So when this first started, before there was really a large commercial interest in this, typically what we would do is we would find a local university near somebody who has an exercise science department, and they would often provide these services. But a lot of times they wouldn't, but sometimes they would. But since that time, there has been an increase in the number of commercially available places where you can do this. So like, for example, I'm going to plug Live Lean RX. If you just go to liveleanrx.com and put in your zip code, you can find, we have 14 locations, I think right now. So you can find a place within an hour where you're at. Sometimes not. But generally, if you can't find a commercial place near you, if you look up your nearest university, again, in the exercise science department, typically you can find some form of body composition and metabolism testing.
Okay, excellent. Let's talk about DEXA a little bit. Let's talk about DEXA as the gold standard. And just full disclosure, in my gym, in my fitness studio, I use an in-body machine. And I am very happy with what it does for my clients, because all I'm looking to do is measure change, right? Whether the numbers are exactly right or not is up for debate, but I just want to see, are they losing muscle? Are they gaining muscle? Are they losing fat? Are they gaining fat? That's how we use it. But talk to us about the difference and why DEXA is the gold standard. And I don't think anybody can argue that.
Okay. So the in-body machine that you're talking about uses bioelectrical impedance, and people are familiar with this. Those are those things like, now this isn't what an in-body does, but if you've ever seen one of those handheld things, or the typical, or your typical bathroom scale, those things use bioelectrical impedance. And that technology basically means that a small electric charge is sent through the body. You can't feel it. And that charge travels at a different velocity depending on whether it's moving through fat or whether it's moving through muscle. And then by knowing that time difference, you can plug it in. The machine plugs it into an equation and gives you a body fat estimation. We had an in-body in our lab, and the way you are using it, that in-body, if your body fat is 20% or 22% is not really important. What you want to know is, how did the body fat change since the last time you got it tested, right? Is your intervention working? And an in-body tracks that change very well. So in other words, I might get on my DEXA and see that my body fat is 15%. And then I get on the in-body and it might say my body fat is 18%. But if I lose 2% fat, the DEXA will say I'm now 13 and the in-body will say I'm now 16. They're both very good at tracking those change, which again is really the only thing you care about. Now, what a DEXA does is a DEXA was originally designed to measure bone density. So if you've ever gone for a test to measure your bone density, often this is done like in the ankle. You'll stick your ankle in a little machine and it'll tell you your bone density. But for body composition, DEXA uses a machine. It's a full body machine where you lie on it, and then a scanner essentially goes over you and basically draws a body fat map. It draws a picture of the body. Essentially what's happening is a very low energy X-ray is being shot through the body, and that X-ray absorbs at different rates depending on whether it's passing through bone, fat, or muscle. So you get, like I said, you get a map that shows you, it'll be like green where the muscle is, it'll be yellow where it's moderate fat. It'll be red where it's high fat. And then you'll also get a full body bone scan to tell you what bone density is. That is the gold standard for body composition measurement. So if you can find a DEXA, and DEXA is accurate to like 1 to 2%. A high quality in-body might be accurate to like 3 to 4%. The thing with the in-body you have to be careful about is because it's measuring water levels, it's based on hydration levels. You just want to make sure that you're the same level of hydration from test to test. You don't want to get on it like as soon as you're done working out because you'll have a lot more blood flow in the skin, which causes a redistribution of fluid. So it might look like you're a different body fat percentage than you actually are. But as long as you're consistent from test to test, you'll get a good, it's reliable in terms of the change. So that's the primary difference. Things like skin fold calipers and stuff like that, those things are much less accurate. Again, you're in that situation, you're really just looking at subcutaneous fat under the skin. So it does, and it's using prediction equations to try and determine what your internal fat is. The DEXA will actually give you a measurement of visceral fat, which is the fat around your organs. That's the most sort of dangerous from a health perspective.
Okay, that's super helpful. I have so many questions. I'm going to start with the bone density because I've most of my population is at an age where this is a concern. And unfortunately, bone density tests don't start until I think it's too late personally. And I've boldly and probably inaccurately been telling some of my women that their skeletal muscle mass is a helpful indicator of them having low bone density. If their skeletal muscle mass is really low because that's the muscle around your bone, then there's a chance that could correlate to them having low bone density. So if I see something that I consider to be alarmingly low, I suggest that they try to get a scan earlier. Am I completely off on that? Or would you say there's some validity to that?
No, you're actually spot on. And I'll tell you, you're actually right on, and I'll tell you why you're right on. So the best way that you can increase bone density is by heavy weightlifting, right? So if you are doing heavy weightlifting for the purpose of increasing bone density, you're going to have higher muscle mass, right? So by using muscle mass as a proxy for bone density, that's absolutely the correct way to view it. So if somebody has very low bone density, bones are not adequately being loaded. And as a result of that, that's why you're going to have bone density. Now, most of bone density is built during adolescence, right? So osteoporosis, we generally think of this as a disease, as like an elderly disease, but I kind of look at it as a childhood disease. Because once that adaptational window, once that developmental window closes after adolescence, it becomes much, much more difficult to add bone. Okay. So the best thing that you can do in terms of osteoporosis prevention is to make sure you build as much of it as possible when you're in adolescence. Now, once you are an adult, then heavy resistance, it doesn't necessarily need to be heavy resistance training, but it needs to be the right kind of resistance training, because essentially what happens is bone grows when that bone is bent. So when a bone gets bent, it stretches, and that stimulates the osteoclasts to build new bone. So if you are doing something like a squat or a deadlift, you're loading those bones longitudinally. You're transmitting force through the hip, which is one of the most common fracture sites. You essentially want to load bone through those what are called clinically relevant sites, right? Which would be the wrist where the breaks occur, the hip, the low back. So when you do those kinds of load-bearing exercises, those are the most effective for increasing bone mass. In fact, I think this is true, that the highest bone masses ever recorded are in elite powerlifters. If you can squat 1,200 pounds, you have to have a pretty high bone density, right? So I think you're absolutely right that people probably get these things measured too late. But this is one of the advantages of being able to get a DEXA scan body composition, because you don't need a prescription to do it. You just walk into the clinic, you pay, and you get the scan, and you're getting a full body bone scan as well. Now, I will say that the technicians who are working in those clinics are not trained to be able to interpret bone scans. So it's not a diagnostic scan, and you shouldn't expect it to be. But it's certainly something that you can take to your doctor and say, hey, here's my output from my scan that I paid whatever $100 for, as opposed to I don't know how many thousands I would have had to do to get at an imaging center, for example. So there's definitely advantages to doing that at a commercial site.
It's a lot. It's a lot of information. That's a really good point. Can you tell us, Todd, as parents and grandparents, and what should we be having our adolescents do that they're not doing?
They should be, well, adolescents today, I want to say it's probably not enough for them just to sort of do intentional exercise. Adolescent activity is so low. I think that adolescent inactivity is the driver of adult chronic disease, personally. I think what we have now is a situation where metabolic, it's just like osteoporosis. You know how I said bones are developed during adolescence? I think my theory is that metabolic capacity is also developed during adolescence. And if a kid is just sedentary on a screen all day long, which most of them are now, unfortunately, that's the reality, then those kids are going to become adults who are metabolically vulnerable to obesity because they have not developed the pathways that robustly burn energy. So if I eat a bunch of food and I haven't really developed the pathways to burn that food, what I have developed well is the capacity to store that food because I'm not active. So now when I become adult and I stop growing, growth allows you to sort of absorb those extra calorie surpluses that you're eating because the system is growing. But just because the system is growing doesn't mean you're developing its metabolic capacity. So now when they hit adulthood, these surpluses automatically go to storage because you haven't developed the capacity to. So that's my current theory. It's not widely accepted because I actually have a paper under review right now pushing that theory, but I think that seems to be a much better explanation for the current obesity and the chronic disease epidemic than some diet-centric model like ultra-processed foods or something like that. So I think the more you can get your kid to do and the more varied that activity is, the better. The guideline is as much as possible. That's the guideline, right? Because if you think about this sort of culturally, once Gen Xers die off, which really isn't that far off, right? There won't be any populations left that remember what it was like to have an active childhood, right? So when a sedentary lifestyle sort of becomes the norm and there's no memory of what an active one is, people forget about the fact that an active lifestyle is important. It just doesn't become something that they consider anymore because it's not anything they ever grew up with. I think that's where we are. I think that's why we are constantly pulling the diet lever to try and address things like insulin resistance and hypertension and abdominal adiposity and things like that. We just think that diet is the only driver behind that, when in reality, inactivity is a much stronger causal driver than the diet is. So
it's more based on physical activity, but obviously diet matters too. What would be your suggestions there?
Well, I wouldn't say that protein matters less in adolescence, because during a growth phase, protein would actually matter more. So I think that eating adequate amounts of protein is good. I think that the new dietary guidelines that increase recommended protein amounts from a minimum of 1.2, that's a very good thing. And then at 1.6, I think that's even better. So I definitely think that hitting those protein goals are critically important during adolescence. Just eating protein it's harder to store fat. It's harder to store protein as fat than it is anything else. Protein is satisfying. It has a high thermic effect, so it'll increase just resting metabolism just by virtue of eating it. So the more protein you can get in the diet as a total percentage of calories, I think that's a good thing to try and do within reason. Yeah, and I think the current recommendation, the current AMDR for protein is something like 35 to 40% of your calories from protein. As long as I recommend people stay to the higher end of that, and also make sure that you're getting your protein from a high quality source. I know working in the lab, we'd have lots of people that would say, "Oh, I get lots of protein because I eat lots of peanut butter." And we'd say, well, that's a really, really good source of fat that happens to have some protein in it. It's not a good source of protein, right? So you don't want to try and hit protein goals and not worry at all about your total calorie intake. And then you'll, of course, have other people that say, well, calories don't matter. You really should just focus on the quality. That's all internet philosophy. There's not evidence that supports that kind of thinking.
I agree. Not true. So one of the things that I have noticed in just my longevity and working with people is that I'm going to talk about two populations. One is women that were dieters have low skeletal muscle mass. That's a Kelly fact, but it's true. So that usually when I see that it's really low in relation to their weight, it's because I believe it's because they spent a lot of their time in a deficit and not eating enough, which kind of speaks to what you were saying earlier. But then I have the other extreme. I have a lot of men that I coach, and they have so much skeletal muscle mass, but they're over fat. I mean, they're obese, but they have so much skeletal muscle mass. And I'll start with the men. So let me just give you some numbers if I can. Their body fat is in the low 20s or mid 20s. Their BMI is 30, but their skeletal muscle mass is off the chart. Obviously, their workouts matter, but their nutrition matters more. They're just eating too much. I mean, they're eating enough protein. They're just eating too much. Can you speak to that from your level of expertise, Todd?
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, we live in an environment where our food supply is essentially designed for us to eat more calories than we need. And we tend to want to say, well, that's sort of an individual failure, right? You're just not eating the right things, or you're just eating too much. But you have to understand that, like, for people like you and me, our worlds revolve around understanding food and things like that. Most people just want to live their lives. And if I go into the grocery store and 60% of the calories in the grocery store are coming from ultra processed foods, and I know that those things, I'm more likely to overconsume on those things, then it becomes really difficult to be able to eat a reasonable amount of calories just based on the food infrastructure right there, without even considering anything else. The other thing is, even when people are actively exercising and working out, we live in a world that is so sedentary that exercise is usually just not enough to offset a sedentary lifestyle, which means it used to be that, let's say, like before the car, like in the late 40s, before car ownership really took off after World War II, people were much more active. So there was a much more caloric buffer to be able to overeat. Right. But now that buffer gets smaller and smaller because people are doing less and less. So it's very difficult to stay in caloric balance and try and eat to match that balance when the activity level is falling. Because the other thing that happens that a lot of people don't realize is that your appetite regulation is tightly coupled with your activity level. Right. And that appetite becomes dysregulated the more inactive you become, right? So if I'm really active, my appetite scales up to meet that demand. You would think that if I'm really inactive, the appetite would scale down to meet that demand, but it doesn't. The more inactive you become, the hungrier you get. And why that happens is beyond the scope of this talk right now. It's an evolutionary mechanism, but it happens. And if you look at what happens at the cellular level in the muscles, inactivity very closely resembles starvation. The same signals happen, which causes the drive to eat. So, we tend to only look at activity as a caloric expenditure thing, right? It's easier to eat a 300 calorie cupcake than it is to run 3 miles. So that's why we say diet is more important than exercise. But we don't think about exercise from the way that it regulates appetite, right? So if I take somebody that's inactive, even if they're going and exercise, let's say they're going into doing a full body weight workout 3 times a week, that's going to be really good for their health. But if they're sedentary all the rest of the time, they're going to have some level of appetite dysregulation, which is going to be very difficult for them to stay in a caloric deficit. So, and when you couple that with a food environment where most of our caloric intake is ultra processed, which is going to tend to drive us to eat more than we normally would if we were eating minimally processed foods, you're sort of setting up this very fragile system where it's a very fragile situation that allows somebody to stay in caloric balance or in a caloric deficit. It's very difficult to achieve that in today's environment.
Yeah, that is super interesting. And I was not going to ask this question at all, but I just have to, out of my own curiosity, GLPs. One of my concerns with what I do is I feel as if people are less motivated to exercise because weight management is often the driver for people to participate in exercise. Do you have anything that you want to share on that?
It's sort of there are pros and cons to the GLP-1 issue, because likely what will happen, this is another paper I've just submitted about GLP-1. So likely what I think is going to happen is GLP-1s are basically going to be the new Botox, right? Like everybody is already at some level trying GLP-1s. So I think these things are going to probably put a dent in obesity prevalence, or at least the severity of obesity. And we'll see this at the population level. The problem I have with that is the mechanism by which GLP-1s work is it essentially kills your appetite and it decreases your intake. And there's a significant amount of muscle loss that occurs with GLP-1 use. So if I take a bunch of if you take somebody who has insulin resistance, high cholesterol, and all these other markers of chronic disease, and you put them on GLP-1s, you will improve those markers, okay? Because you're decreasing the caloric load on the body. You're eating less, right? So those markers are going to improve. But what you're not doing is improving the underlying metabolic machinery that's responsible for burning fuel in the first place. In fact, it's more likely to go the other direction, because as somebody eats less, you very often have less energy and you don't feel like exercise. So we're going to have this is, again, my belief. And if anybody's interested in this, I have a Substack where I write about all this stuff. So go to Substack and you can see I've written about all these things. I think what you're going to see at scale is improved markers at the population level, but a masking of the underlying dysfunction, which is eventually it's eventually going to show up somewhere, right? This is why I think this is one of the reasons why people gain their weight back so quickly when they stop GLP-1s. So I don't want to bash GLP-1s, because I think they're going to be very helpful for a certain segment of the population. But getting back to your initial point about aesthetics driving why somebody wants to exercise, I know over my life that's been the case. I mean, I've said this to my students for 20 years. If exercise didn't make me look good, I would never do it, right? So, I mean, I might now that I'm older, but it was never sort of the initial driving factor, right? Like, I never saw a very attractive woman and said, wow, I bet she has low blood pressure. It's not the drive why people work out. So I think that you're absolutely right, that people who have struggled for their entire lives, who are trying to just look better and have never really been able to maintain that long term. Most people know how to lose weight. They just don't know how to keep it off. They've never been able to keep it off. So I do think you are going to see, you already see it. I mean, you're already ready to see widespread use of GLP-1s, even at their current price point. As those things become cheaper, again, it's going to be, everybody's going to be on, everybody. So I don't know what the long-term outcome of that is going to be, but anything that sort of contributes to a decrease in physical activity across the lifespan, I think is not a good thing. And the thing that really bothers me about this, and what really worries me about this, is GLP-1s are approved for kids as young as 12 years old. So when we were talking about that developmental window, right? If you're taking a kid who has a threat of becoming obese during adolescence, and you start giving GLP-1s, and you're decreasing their caloric intake and potentially decreasing the drive for them to be active, you're further limiting the growth of that metabolic machinery that's responsible for energy consumption as an adult. And I just, what is the consequence of a lifetime on GLP-1s? I mean, like I said, it might improve the markers and it might decrease obesity for a while, but it's a symptomatic treatment rather than a systems level treatment.
Yeah, it's super interesting, and I'm really glad you're doing work on it. And I want to look at it from the lens of somebody that does what I do, which is help people be consistent with exercise, is what I really do. And to fitness professionals to help kind of bridge that gap. Like, I'm not particularly comfortable advertising to say, like, I help people that are on, it doesn't feel like what I do. But at the same time, I'd love to help them, and I'd love to invite more people into exercise. And I get everything that you're saying, but like, any advice for fit pros in general?
Yeah. I mean, it's funny that, because I was just thinking in my head before you said that, if I was getting into the fitness industry right now, my whole thing would be GLP-1 programming. That's what I would do, because people are going to do it. People are going to do it. And it's not, again, I don't think this is any type of moral failing. What I think this is we have an infrastructure, a system-wide infrastructure in society that we've systematically removed physical activity out of society. And then we ask people to go to a gym and do something that they're not evolutionary wired to do, right? Like, from an evolutionary perspective, to run on a treadmill makes absolutely no sense at all. We are not evolved to just go out and be with no outcome at the end of it, right? Humans evolved for nearly 2 million years with food being a scarcity and calories being a scarcity. Right? If you were a caveman that liked exercise, natural selection would have killed you off. So we aren't wired to do activity. You're never going to, I believe you will never get people to do intentional exercise at scale, at population scale, because we've engineered it out of our world. What we need to do, and this is my big push, this is what I work on, I think that we need to re-engineer activity back into society so that people are forced to be active without them really knowing that, without them thinking about it, right? Like, think about it. I mean, I'm sitting down on my sofa last night watching Netflix, and I have a robot cleaning my vacuum, right? Vacuuming my floor, right? We don't even think about those things. We think about all these sort of time-saving device is really just a device that makes you more sedentary. That's what a time-saving device is. And our whole society is designed around time saving, right? So I don't think that it's, again, a moral failing or a personal problem that people have as far as exercise. I think the oddballs are the ones who do it. Those are the oddballs, right? So if we are going to design a society where they're not capable of really being physically active enough to be healthy without going against evolution, and we have a food system that can't really support the dietary guidelines at scale. Like the new dietary guidelines could not, our food system would completely crash if a third of our population followed the guidelines, right? We just don't, we can't grow enough food and we don't have enough high quality protein sources to be able to meet that demand. So the guidelines couldn't work at the population level. So in that situation, you can't really blame people. I think that GLP-1s is sort of the natural lever to pull because it allows you to at least, if nothing else, get the illusion of health, right? Without really going against the evolutionary hardwiring that we can't really ignore.
That's just such good perspective. I really appreciate that. And I think I just want to echo what you said from the physical activity standpoint. I hear it all the time. Oh, it's so much easier. They drop it off at my door. I'm like, you know how many steps I get when I go to Costco? Out to the car, push the car. It's a push. It's a whole workout. It's a whole thing. Cleaning my house. But I understand that if your energy is low, then it's a big circle and it's mind-blowingly interesting. And I think that this conversation is actually really powerful. I do want to go back, and this is a little bit selfish of me, Todd, but I want to ask something that I struggle with as a trainer, a subset of women in particular, often vegetarians, not always, body fat in the 40s, closer to 50. They're working out. They're strong. They're trying. I can't move their numbers. It's just so, we go 2%, 2 down, back up the next time, percent. And it's like, then I got my women in their 20s that will, like, as soon as they reel it in a little bit, they're dropping 4%. It's like, I want to help the women in the 40s. And I just love any suggestions and anything that you have to say on that.
It's a really difficult problem to solve because it's probably a multifactorial problem. And there's probably a lot of things all going on at the same time. So you don't want to say, well, you're just not doing enough. People can do a lot of exercise and exercise hard, but I think they just don't realize what kind of contribution the physical activity that should be built into normal daily life actually contributes to that. And if you are just relying on exercise to be able to create that caloric deficit, even if you manipulate diet at the same time, it's really hard to create large enough caloric deficits to actually result in meaningful changes in body fat. And like I said about appetite regulation as well, there's a theory of constrained energy. It's called the constrained energy theory, that when an individual starts exercising, if they continue to exercise for like a chronic period of time over weeks and months, the body adapts in such a way that you burn less calories during that activity, right? And that's true. You know that somebody will burn more calories when they're not good at something, right? So, I think that there's probably some of that going on. I mean, this is probably why people start and have some results and then plateau, right? But you can't just have progressively increasing exercise intensity in somebody who's 40 years old, because then you increase the chance of injury, you increase the chance of fatigue and burnout. They're going to get discouraged because they're just not getting there. So this is where I think that other activity has to be incorporated in without them really thinking that they're doing anything. And unfortunately, we talked about, one of the things we sort of alluded to was the difference between men and women and muscle mass and things like that. Remember when I mentioned metabolic capacity being developed in adolescence, right? Well, we know when we look at physical activity in kids, the physical activity in females drops by about half of what it is in males by the time they're like 13 or 14 years old, right? Like, girls don't want to get their hair messed up in gym class and stuff. Like, guys are like, I don't care, right? So just across the board, I think that if my theory is plausible about metabolic capacity being developed during your childhood and it's related to inactivity, the more inactive you are going to be in childhood, the more likely you are to become obese and have a harder time getting rid of that body fat as an adult. So that would be consistent with why it's much, you hear women say all the time, yeah, my husband just stops putting cream in his coffee and he loses weight, and I can, not eat 3 days and I gain a pound. Right. So, like I said, it's a multifactorial problem. But I think that the psychological problem is women want to give up. Like you said, the main motivating factor for doing it is you want to look better, right? Well, if I've been doing this for 6 months and I don't look any different, then why am I doing it, right? So I think the thing to sort of focus on there, you have to make people understand that exercise, the health benefits to exercise are completely independent of weight loss, right? You definitely improve things like insulin resistance, metabolic flexibility, hypertension, lipid profile. All those things improve as a result of exercise, whether or not you lose weight and whether or not you change the diet. They're completely independent. So if you can get people to understand that and try and get them to focus on the health benefits, I think you can get them to adhere for a longer period of time. The other thing to understand is people just have unrealistic expectations about how fast they're going to change. If it took you 20 years to gain the fat that you have, and then you finally decide you're going to start getting rid of it, you can't expect significant change in 6 months. You just can't. And that's not only a fault of the client, it's also the fault of the trainer, who often says, oh yeah, we can do that. You can do that. You just got to do X, Y, Z. I think sometimes we make those expectations unrealistic just as much as the client does. So
I tell them this is going to be really hard, but give us a year and we're going to get you in your 30s and then it's going to start moving faster. And it really is true. It's true. But it's so hard. It's such a long year. And it's the...
Right. And that's why I think to make a lifestyle change that you're going to, because basically you're making a change that you're going to do forever. Right. And if you're doing something and you think to yourself, can I picture myself doing this forever? If the answer to that is no, you need to find a different approach.
I love that you just said that.
Right. So
I'm so happy right now.
Right. That goes for diet and activity. So, I think this is where I think policy comes into play. I think that we have to stop saying this person just doesn't move enough, right? And we have to start saying, how can we change our world so that movement isn't an option? And if you think about it, it's everything. I mean, just the fact that you're brushing your teeth, you used to have to do this, right? Now you just hold the electric brush there. Everything. If you go through your day and think about everything that is now automatic, that used to be something you had to manually do, it would shock you. You would be,
entrepreneurs' minds should be spinning. Like, how do we go backwards in time and make things more physical? It's like,
yeah. I mean, my wife and I, we always have this thing where, like, if we go grocery shopping, we'll find the farthest spot in the parking lot. And we have the thing we're always thinking is, what is the path of most resistance, right? The path of most resistance. It's the exact opposite of what you normally feel like doing. That's what you have to do.
That is so good, Todd. And going back to exercise a little bit, and I know you mentioned the heavy strength training, and I want to say something about that. And again, I'm not here to you to agree with me. I just like things that I've seen over time. Heavy strength training doesn't necessarily mean like you need to find that you need to be doing 50-pound deadlifts or 100-pound deadlifts. I believe that people can get stronger by getting their muscles tired, by working to fatigue or failure, whether it be with load or reps. And for some people, it's safer and more comfortable and more likely that that's how they're going to train. That's how I train my people. It seems to have worked well over time. And not to say that, and there is progression for sure. And, progression can be the number of push-ups they can do. But I'm just curious, like if you have like a secret sauce protocol or what your thoughts are on that.
Well, let me clarify what I said, because you're 100% correct. When I said heavy strength training, like with respect to osteoporosis, that's when the load how heavy the load is really matters, right? Like the reason power lifters have the highest bone density is because they lift the heaviest loads, which results in the greatest bending of the bone. But if you look at a power lifter, they're not the leanest people in the world, right? So when it comes to muscle metabolism and like caloric burn and things like that, you're absolutely right. You don't need to be lifting maximal loads. And I'm not trying to, if I did imply that everybody should be lifting these heavy loads, that's not really what I meant. It is, I think what you said about working the muscle till it's tired, or essentially till, I think, training a muscle to failure is actually the way to maximize that muscle's metabolic capacity and its ability to burn energy, really, which is really what you're trying to do. And, we used to think that there was this range where like 8 to 12 was the number one in the range, but it really boils down to volume. And volume is your reps times your set times your load. So how much weight are you actually moving? And it doesn't need to be heavy. If it's a relatively light load, you just do more reps. And the closer you get to failure, regardless of the load that you're lifting, the greater the metabolic effect that's going to have on the muscle. So yeah, I think I don't have I shouldn't say I don't have a sort of prescription. I do have a general prescription. I think that as far as weight training, I've always been a fan of full body workouts. And this is because full body workouts engage the most amount of muscle, and that leads to the greatest amount of oxygen that's consumed during recovery. Basically, when you are doing weight training, you're not trying to burn calories during a weight training session. You're trying to break down that muscle so that muscle repairs, and that repair process is very energy intensive. It burns a lot of calories. But if you're just doing bicep curls, you're not breaking down enough muscle for that burn to really be significant. So full body workouts where you engage a lot of muscle that you break down 3 times a week, for example, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, full body workouts, those things, you can increase your resting metabolic rate by 20% just as your body is recovering those from that type of workout. So, if your resting metabolic rate is 1,500 calories and you're increasing it 20%, that's another 300 calories that you're burning as a result of that training throughout the week. So that, that's what we always did at the lab. Like I don't remember, but our prescription at the lab was cardio is optional. If you want to do cardio, you can do cardio. But I think that if somebody is metabolically compromised, let's say they aren't really somebody who's ever exercised, they generally can tolerate strength training a lot easier than they can aerobic exercise. Aerobic exercise is exhausting, right? Like, think about it. I mean, it goes back to the evolutionary thing. If you take somebody who's sedentary and you run them on a treadmill for a half hour, you feel worse when it's over than you did when it started. You don't come off of that experience thinking, boy, I can't wait to do that again, right? So I think what an individual should do is, if you've never trained before, you really should start with resistance training, because that allows you to build the metabolic machinery that can then tolerate those aerobic loads later on, right? But we do it just the opposite. We tell people who never exercised before, the first thing they do is they say, well, I'm going to go run on a treadmill, or I'm going to train for a marathon. Why people do that, I never understood that. But I think it really should just be the opposite. And women historically tend to shy away from weightlifting. There's still that notion it's going to make me big and bulky and things like that. And, those are just myths that we still fight, on a regular basis.
No, I think it's really changing, but I think it's gone too much the other way, Todd. I've seen it go too much the other way. I have women that they're really overweight and they're like, I want to put on muscle. I'm like, we got to get rid of the fat and you keep your muscle. I don't want you to lose that. You have beautiful muscle. Their skeletal muscle mass is beautiful. Let's keep all of it. I don't want you to lose any of it. You might have to lose a little bit, but it has gone the other way.
And what's the point of having it if you can't see it?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And yeah, it is interesting. And I love that we talked, we're kind of past I could talk to you forever, and I'm so grateful for your time.
Mind.
I wanted to just ask you, I know we talked way more about exercise, which is fantastic, but I did want to ask you, your thoughts on macros. Just for a lot of my clients, that is something that they consider. And I would just love to know your thoughts.
I think that you can get in the weeds on it, but I do think it's something that you need to be consider. And because, again, I feel like the more stuff you can measure, the better idea you have of what you can get away with in terms of your diet. So I think that if you can get your metabolism measured, like here, like your example of the 40-year-old woman who can't lose weight. If you, and we've had this experience in our labs, someone would come in, we'd measure their metabolism, and their metabolism is 25 or 30% slower than it's predicted to be. There's an underlying issue there, and that person is never going to be able to get in deficit unless that issue is addressed. Maybe it's a thyroid issue, maybe it's a low muscle mass issue, whatever it is. You just simply can't feed somebody that low enough. It's low enough to put them in a deficit. It's not realistic. They'll starve, right? So at least you should be able to, you should try and figure out what your resting metabolic rate is so that you get a good idea of the caloric content. So that's the plan. The plan is figure out how many calories somebody can eat. Ideally, you'd want to get a body composition test so you know their muscle mass, and you'd base the protein intake on the muscle mass. That's non-negotiable, right? Protein is the thing that you have to maximize. And then as far as fat and carbs, you got much more room to be able to mess with those things. If somebody says, well, I don't want to eat carbs, I want to eat more fat, go ahead. As long as you're eating enough protein, and as long as you understand that if you're eating no carb, or if you're eating very, very low carb, there's a very good chance, and you're trying to eat in a deficit, and you're trying to exercise, it's very likely that you're going to take a bunch of your dietary protein and you're going to convert it to carb, and then you're not going to have enough protein to be able to maximize your muscle mass. So as long as somebody's caloric intake is calculated correctly, and as long as somebody's protein intake is calculated correctly, you're okay. And protein, even if you can't calculate it, just make sure you're eating 30 or 40 grams of protein 3 or 4 times a day, and you're probably going to be getting enough. That's pretty much the goal. But again, if you can find a place that does these things, Live Lean, we'll do that. We'll test your metabolism, we'll test your body composition, and we'll design a program for you based on those.
That is so valuable. Absolutely valuable. We'll absolutely put the links for people to do that in the show notes. And I think you talked about it a little bit, but what are you working on right now, Todd? What are you most passionate about?
Well, right now, actually, I just finished writing a book and the book is really about the systematic removal of inactivity from society and how we keep trying to, again, improve chronic disease by manipulating diet when we're really not addressing the thing that's really driving the problem. So as through that process of writing that book, I've started writing a bunch of papers sort of pursuing those avenues, systemic changes at scale, GLP-1s addressed in some of those writings. But the best, if anybody's interested, go to my Substack. I write a column on there called The Flux Files by Todd Miller, and to read pretty much the lay version of everything that I'm publishing in peer-reviewed articles right now.
I need to enter that world. That sounds super interesting and way better than a lot of the stuff we're consuming in our daily lives on social media. I think that's going to be a little bit more valuable, especially for someone like me.
Yeah, I mean, the thing you have to know about social media, and I don't think a lot of people realize this, is that things that are wrong get people angry. And stuff that gets people angry gets people to comment and gets people to engage. And the algorithms like engagement. So the more controversial something is, the more likely it is to be wrong. Right? It's just a logical sort of, if you just connect those dots, that's what you come up with, So try and keep that in mind as you're scrolling and you're seeing the things that seem to be getting the most attention. It's typically because they're the most wrong.
This has been incredible, Todd, and I'm incredibly grateful to you and all of your knowledge, and the way you shared it, I think is really going to be helpful for our audience. I will definitely share how people can can get in touch with you and do the DEXA. Actually, that DEXA is I didn't even really think about it because that is something that I'm passionate about with my women clients, especially a lot of them perimenopausal, menopausal, they've got so much going on. And I do think that we're missing that information, and that is a great workaround, and it tells you so much more information. And I still have my papers and my reports, and I like to look back at them, and there's just lots of, especially someone that, unfortunately, it's like you're preaching to the choir with that stuff. It's like the people that are going to want to do it are people like me that are like, how can I get to the next level? But I think that people in between would be like me. And I'm so sorry, Todd. I should have said this. When I was talking 40s, I was very ambiguous. I meant like 40% body fat. So I was saying women that have like 40 to 50% body fat, it's so hard to move it. Versus like once they get their body fat into the 30s, low 30s or the 20s, then it's like, oh, it moves really quickly. So yeah, getting a prescription as far as that goes could be incredibly helpful based on your numbers, which is what we always like to say. This isn't random. This is based on your numbers. Anything else? Any parting words for our Start Before You're Ready community?
No, I don't think so. Been a pleasure. And yeah, I'd love to do it again sometime. Maybe when my book comes out.
Absolutely. What's the name of your book?
It's called The Amish Paradox.
Oh.
Yeah. So the book is basically about, as I said, like if you look at, there's been studies done in old order Amish, and these are the Amish who use the least amount of modern technology. And their diets are very heavy in refined flour, sugar, pies, cake, biscuits, fried food, lard, butter, ice cream, candy. Basically, everything we've told is what drives, creates, and virtually no chronic disease. But, they do 15,000 steps a day, 40 hours of moderate intensity work per week. So they're basically protected from their diet by their physical activity. So, if the same diet can cause disease in one population, but not cause disease in another population, then diet can't be the driver of disease. It has to be something else. And that something else is inactivity.
Oh my gosh, that sounds fabulous. When does it come out?
My agent is shopping it around to publishers right now, so it'll be a while, but I will definitely let you know. Absolutely.
Todd, if you'd be willing, I'd love to have you come on and talk. I can't wait to read it and talk exclusively about that. That's fantastic. My kids, we go to Annapolis, and they love this Amish market, and it's exactly how you described it. And I really never thought about it, but that is so true. They're so physically, of course they can eat that stuff. It's different. That's really good. And it's real food though. See, I enjoy it, but that's not what you're getting in a package. You're not getting that pie.
Right. And that diet isn't really any different than what our diet was in the 30s and 40s and 50s when we had no obesity. So it's got to be something else.
Thank you so much, Todd. And we'll definitely have you back on to talk about the book. That sounds incredible.
All right. Very good. Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Start Before You're Ready. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share with a friend who might need a little motivation. Ready to start your own journey? Check out our workouts and nutrition coaching programs at kellysbootcamp.net. You can choose from in-person sessions or virtual programs. Set up a complimentary coaching session to get started. Follow along with me and the show on social media at Kellys_bootcamp. Until next time, this is Kelly Young reminding you that the best time to start is always now.